everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and welcome to this intro to React. So this video is going to be the basics of React in about 60 minutes. So this is going to be a longer video, but the idea here is that this video will get you situated with using React. Now, first off, let's just talk about what you should know before watching this video. You should already be familiar with HTML. You should already be familiar with CSS. You should already have a grasp of JavaScript and DOM manipulation. When I say DOM manipulation, being able to like add event listeners to things, move items around the screen, whether you're using just plain JavaScript to do so or using something like jQuery. If you don't have experience in these things, I recommend to do that first. Go back and watch my HTML masterclass video, my CSS 101 videos, my DOM manipulation videos, the jQuery videos, because that foundation is going to make you appreciate more what React does and how React works. Okay, it'll be much higher learning curve without that foundation. So I would review that first. But once you do learn React, the ideas that you will learn in learning React will translate into other frameworks. So the big front-end frameworks are React, Vue, Angular, and Svelte. Okay, and there's also something new that just came out that's kind of building up some hype called Solid.js. But again, once you learn React and you get comfortable with React, learning all those other frameworks will be a hop and a skip because they're all kind of doing the same thing. Now, what is that thing? What is it that React brings to the table? Well, normally we would write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to create a web page. And you would use your JavaScript to create interactivity, some dynamic aspects to your web page to like change where things are, have things respond to things like that. But the way you would write your front-end JavaScript typically was what was called imperative. So you would say something like, okay, hey, let me put this button in a variable. Okay, let's take that button, let's add an event listener that says when this button is clicked, run this function. So you would basically do like a laundry list of saying do this, do that, do this, do this. This is what's referred to as imperative programming, meaning you give a list of instructions. Okay, and most programming is still, in general, imperative. But what React does, and most of these frameworks do, is they give you sort of a more declarative style. Now, what declarative style is, instead of me saying do this, do this, do this, like giving you the steps to make the thing, I'm going to tell you what I want, and you make the thing. So instead of me saying, like, for example, imagine I'm a chef, and I say, okay, give me 2 pieces of bread. Put some mayonnaise on 2 pieces of bread. Put some meat between those 2 pieces of bread. Mush them together. At the end, you have a sandwich, but you didn't know what you were making until you were done. Okay? That's sort of more an imperative style of giving instructions. Declarative would be like, make me a pastrami sandwich. I gave you the direction, but I didn't necessarily tell you all the steps. What I did is I told you what the end result is. And that's kind of what React does. What we're going to do is we kind of describe what the page should look like and where certain data should show up. And React will kind of build that out for us. And then what's going to happen is that whenever that data changes, React will then update the thing that it made. Okay, so if I say, hey, insert meat here, and then now I say, hey, you know, now the meat's prosciutto, well, now it'll have prosciutto. And then if the meat changes to roast beef, hey, look, the sandwich now has roast beef. So we declare what we want, and then as the data changes, those places where those like sort of placeholder or variables are will just automatically update, which is wonderful, because in like if you were using jQuery or just plain JavaScript, if the data would change, you would have to kind of like erase everything and then rebuild everything, which can be very tedious. So that's one of sort of the main things that React does. It kind of allows us to describe our user interface in a declarative way. We say, hey, this is what we want. 2, it also allows us to break our UI. Instead of, so traditionally you would have like an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file. And in the HTML, you would describe how the page, kind of the structure of the page. In the CSS, you would describe how everything's like styled, the aesthetics. And then in the JavaScript, you would do all the interactive stuff. So there's still a separation of concerns in React, but the difference is that you don't separate it by the type of code. So all your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript can get jumbled together, but instead you describe it as components. And components represent like a small piece of your UI, like your nav bar, or a button, or a footer. And what we do is we create components in React and then think of them as like building blocks, and then we can just reassemble those building blocks, which again was really nice because then we can reuse those building blocks. So these are like sort of the concepts of what React and these other front-end libraries are bringing to the table. Cool. Now that we kind of understand like the why are we using React? We're not just doing because if you just learn React just because, hey, people told you can get a job in React, you're gonna miss the point. It's gonna be really harder to understand what React's doing for you. So now that we know the why, let's actually start building React. Now you do need to have a few things. You do need to have Node installed. So if you do not have Node installed, you want to head over to nodejs.org and download. I recommend downloading the latest version of Node. Okay, it's a slight difference, but there's beneficial differences in that latest version, and how it handles like ES modules, which is nice. Cool. So get that latest version of Node installed. You should be familiar with the terminal. Okay, so if you're not familiar with like working inside a Bash terminal, then also watch my video on Bash scripting. Okay. If you're going to be a developer, you really need to get good with the terminal. You don't have to be amazing. You just kind of need to be able to navigate your way through different folders, use Git, stuff like that. Not covering that in this video. I do have videos on that. Check those out. Cool. So I have Node installed, and now I want to create a new React project. Okay. Now so instead of, you could create a React project from scratch, it's a lot more work than really necessary. So React, which is created by Facebook, provides you a standard template called Create React App. It's not the only React template. I know I've made several templates. There are several other sort of different third-party React templates out there. And also just complete frameworks that are built on React, like Next.js, Gatsby, etc. So there's a lot of ways to start with React, but we're going to start with the standard Facebook template, which is called Create React App. So what we do is we use npx. npx is a feature in Node that allows you to kind of run a generator like one time. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's probably the simplest way to think about it. So the people at Facebook, they made this generator, Create React App, that'll generate a React project for us. So I'm saying, hey, I want to run this generator one time, and then afterwards I put the name of the folder I'd like to generate this project in. So we're just going to call it First React. This is our first React project. So then it's going to run this script that's going to take a while. Okay, for me it might be a little fast because I've done it so many times, so there's a lot of cached stuff. But if it's the first time you run this, it may take like 10 minutes. Okay, but it's going to basically scroll out, and you can see like, hey, look, a folder here got created called First React, and this has all my React source code. Okay, cool. So now once that's done, I can cd into that folder. So I want to cd in my terminal into that folder, and I can see currently right now I'm not in the folder. I'm in my React folder where I generate React projects. I want to go into this First React. That's my project. So cd change directories into First React. So see, now I'm in my First React folder. Okay, and again, my prompt may look a little bit different than yours because I do customize it with Starship RS. But if you're ever wondering what folder you're in, you can always just do pwd, print working directory, and it'll show you exactly what folder you're in on your computer. Okay. So whenever you use a template, a Node template, so if you're using Vue, Angular, Svelte, if you try those out later on, always look in the package.json. In the package.json, we have a section called scripts. And this section called scripts will tell us any scripts that are built into the template. So we see here we have npm start, build, test, reject. Okay. Now what these scripts do, they're kind of hidden because Facebook tries to hide a lot of the implementation details to keep the file structure not too messy. So what it's doing is really kind of hidden behind these React scripts. If you wanted to see what was going on under the hood, you could run this eject command, which then kind of unhides everything. I would do that. I would eventually do that once you get comfortable with React. I think it is valuable to go in there and just kind of see what's going on in the guts at least once. Just do a dummy project, eject it, and just explore. But you could never look at it and just be fine. Okay, it's not something you really need to know. And if you're new to package.json files, the other really kind of important properties here is this dependency section. So any libraries that this project is using will be listed here. So this is the stuff that it's using out of the gate. but we'll be able to install more things if we want to add other features to our React project. But this is sort of what it uses out of the gate. Okay, cool. But basically, the thing is that to actually run our project so we can actually see it at work, the command is npm start. This starts our development server. And in a second, we'll see like sort of the standard page. Okay, so there it is. There's your basic React page. Cool. That's just like default code that's in there. Basically, all the code that builds your page is in the source folder. Now, this isn't the code you're actually going to deploy. Okay, what React under the hood does is use what's called a bundler. What the bundler does is that when you're fine and done and you're happy with your website, you're going to run a command, which we saw in package.json, the build command. And what that command will do is that it'll take all the files in your source folder and run them through what's called Webpack. And then Webpack turns it into a small bundle of files in a folder called, I think it's called build. And then that's going to be like the website you actually deploy. Okay, so just so you know, it looks like if you've ever created like an HTML CSS website, usually you just have like one HTML file, one CSS file, one JavaScript file. And here you're going to see like lots of JavaScript files, lots of CSS files, lots of stuff. What happens, all this stuff goes through the grinder Webpack, but you don't worry about that. You just worry about making sure this all looks nice, that it looks good in your dev, when you're running your dev server, and then when you're happy with it, you're going to run that build command and it'll build you your final output. Okay, that you'll then go ship off online. Okay, and oftentimes something like Netlify will just do that for you. Okay, so with that, okay, now basically the way it works is that, let me just see where that HTML file here is. So basically the way React works is like, let's say here's the index.html that kicks off the website. Now if we look at it and we take a look at the body of the HTML, notice there's not really much here. Like if we take a look at the body, there's nothing there. So where's all this coming from? Okay, basically the way React works is that there's always like a root div. This could be anything, but the idea is that there's just this is sort of the entry point, this div. Now if I go to the index.js here, what this index.js does, if we see right here, React DOM.render, this render function says we're going to render this code here. And see, this is grabbing that div that we saw earlier. So saying, hey, get the element that has the ID of root. So this is saying, hey, render this where this is. So essentially, this component here called app gets rendered in that div. So basically, what happens, React pretty much just replaces the website with that app component. So essentially, your whole website, everything about your website is really inside your JavaScript. Okay, you never really need to touch this for the most part. Okay, but just so you understand what this file is doing, it's importing our app component from app.js, which we'll see is exported from there, and it's just saying, hey, inject that component where that div is in that HTML file, and that is it. Okay, so really, app becomes our entry point. App is really where you start doing your work, where you start making your website. And that's why it's called the app component, because it represents your application. And components in React are now more traditionally written functions. They used to be written in classes. You could still write them using classes, but I'm going to focus on sort of the more newer modern syntax, which is using functions. Okay, and let's take a look. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to erase all this. So you see here, the app component is really literally just a function called app. It's just a function called app, and that all it does is it returns what looks like a bunch of HTML. How does that work? I've never been able to write HTML in my JavaScript before. You're not. Okay, this is a syntax called JSX. This is something that Facebook invented. And what you do with JSX is you write this HTML-like syntax, and then again, remember how I mentioned that we were going to run that code through Webpack that's going to bundle it all up. In that Webpack build, they use a tool called Babel, and Babel's for translating JavaScript stuff. So Facebook wrote this custom Babel plugin that allows it to translate JSX. So when it sees this HTML stuff in your code, which is known as JSX, that's what it's called, JSX. Okay, it's going to see this, and whenever it sees JSX, it's actually going to translate it to JavaScript. So there's actually like real JavaScript going on under the hood, but it looks really ugly and really complicated. So instead of us having to write that, we just write what looks like HTML. And the Webpack and Babel will figure out the actual sort of like how do we turn this into, you know, the actual React code that React actually runs. Okay, so this is one of the nice things about React. We don't have to worry about writing anything too complicated. Cool. So let's just talk about this JSX thing first. Okay. Okay, so I want to just rewrite this app function. Okay, because I prefer using arrow functions. So const app equals. So, and again, you can write your function any way you want. So you can use any of the normal and notice I'm getting this error here. The reason being is that, see, this function right now is not returning anything. For a component to work, it has to return JSX. So the simplest thing I can do is I can just return like an H1 that says hello world. And see, I get hello world. Okay, so see this, my app component, literally all it does is return an H1. Okay, but now let's try this. What if I added an H2? Hello again. I should get an error. Okay, so now let's take a look at the error. So you notice it says adjacent JSX elements must be wrapped in an enclosing tag. One of the rules of JSX is that there can only be one main tag. So notice that H1 and H2 are both at the same level. So if I want to have both of those tags, there has to be something that's like a parent to them. So what I can do is I can all wrap this in a div. So I'll just put a div there, and let me just put the closing tag of the div at the end. Okay, and that works because technically there's only one parent div, one parent element. Okay, but sometimes you don't want to be injecting a bunch of extra divs everywhere. So a feature that React has is inside its JSX syntax is what's called a fragment. So what I can do is instead of writing div, I just wrap my code in just an empty angle brackets. And that's called a fragment. And what that does is just makes it where I don't need to wrap everything in a div. So you could just always just use a fragment and not have to think about it. Okay? And essentially this is sort of what you end up with. Okay, and let me just save here. And traditionally, you generally wrap it in a parentheses. You generally wrap your JSX in a parentheses. Nowadays, Babel's pretty good at figuring out your noticing the JSX. So like if you don't put the parentheses there, it knows, but not a bad habit. Okay, and the way you have to think about JSX is that it's its own value. Okay, so while traditionally you will write it right after the return statement for the function, I could create variables that hold JSX. So I could sit here and say, hey, const goodbye. I'm creating a variable in my function before I return a value. Because again, it's just a function. So I can do whatever I want before I return. So I'm going to create a variable called goodbye, which equals an H3. And that says goodbye. Goodbye. Right now, you don't see it on the screen because it's not part of the JSX that's being returned. So the only thing that's going to be visible is whatever JSX that component is returning, whatever HTML that component is returning. So what I can do, though, is I can inject variables in my JSX. So if you ever use like a templating library like an EJS or a Pug or Handlebars, you're probably familiar with like injecting data into a template. This works very similarly. So if you ever want to inject any variable or any JavaScript expression in your JSX, you just wrap it in curly brackets. So I put curly brackets there and I can write the word goodbye. And what that says is say, hey, inject whatever the value of the goodbye variable is in here. In this case, since it's JSX, it just injects that H3 there. Nice. But it doesn't have to be JSX. I could inject a string there. So I can be const hello equals the string hello. And then I can inject hello. And see there, we see the hello. So you can do a lot of stuff with that. Like that's pretty useful. Okay? In writing a component. Now, you could, and like notice, like the way you write a component is like we write our code here, and then we export the component at the end. Now, nowadays you don't have to import React every time. So you'll see, notice it doesn't have like an import of React. Traditionally you had to, so you would have to do this, import React from React. Right now I do recommend still writing that, because what's going to happen is that there's a bunch of functions inside React that you might want to use. But I'm just going to put that there just so you've seen it. The cool thing is that this is just one component. I can actually write more components. So I can go here, the source. I will just, usually what you do is you create a folder called components. That way it's kind of all organized. And you can organize it further from there. Again, these are just files. I'll create a new file. We'll call it hello.js. And I'll just create another component. So I'll import React. So import React from React. And then what I will do, that's it. I will create a component. It's just a function. Hello equals. Now here what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in you can define, there's basically every component gets passed one argument. And that's called props. Okay, and you'll see how props works in a second. But you should always generally put props in here. We don't do it in app because generally you're not passing props to app. But for all other components, you should pass in props. Okay, and you'll see how we can use that in just a moment. But first, I return some JSX, so we'll just say h1 hello component. So see, there's my component. But again, for me to use it, I got to go use it in app because app is what's being injected in my in the browser. So this is not visible right now. I haven't used it. But to use it somewhere else, I got to export it. So I'm going to do export default, and I'm going to export hello. Okay. So if you've been using Node before, like doing Express, you probably have used things like require. But since we're using Webpack here, Webpack allows us to use Es6 Module Syntax. So because Node was created before ES6, so before that module syntax was created, they did this. Now, nowadays, in the newest version of Node, you can use ES module syntax if you change certain settings. But traditionally, like when it's a pure Node project, you have to use require. But with Webpack, since Webpack's translating all our JavaScript with Babel and all that stuff, it's configured to allow us to use this syntax, which is pretty nice because it's pretty obvious. I'm importing React and then I'm exporting this hello function. Nice. That's pretty clear. So now that I've exported this hello component out of that file, I can go back to my app file and import it. So I'll say, hey, I want to import hello from ./components/hello. And now I import the component. And now if I erase all of this, and then and the way you use a component is like an HTML tag. So I just write hello. Hello is not defined. Is it not? It's right there. Components hello. Let me refresh the page. Where am I writing hello? Oh, hello here. It's not defined. Where did I use hello? Oh wait, did I type? Oh, I'm supposed to type. See, I called the function hello uppercase, but I exported hello lowercase. Case sensitivity. Okay, so let me refresh. Sometimes you just have to refresh here. There we go. Hello component. And you see, I imported the component because essentially what it is, really the hello is just a function. Again, we just wrote a function that returns JSX. But again, JSX allows us to use those functions as if they were HTML tags because it just looks easier to write. Okay, so it takes a lot of that sort of underlying JavaScript complexity and hides it within writing HTML or HTML-like syntax, which is really cool, which makes it really nice to write because it feels like you're just writing normal HTML and you're just defining HTML tags, your components. But let's see how that props things work. Okay, so how do I make use of this props variable here? Let's try. Instead of using hello component, what I'm going to do is I'm going to interpolate a variable called props.cheese. Wait, but I never declared any cheese property, so how does it know props.cheese? It's blank. Well, the way props works, it's an object made up of any properties passed to the component. So if I say cheese equals hello, well, I'm a coder, not a writer. So yeah, but you see here, what happens is that any properties here that I pass to the component become part of this object, of this props object. So if I added another property, we'll say bread equals rye. And actually, yeah, bread equals rye. Okay, and I can just use that property instead. Bread. Okay, and see now it changes to rye because I'm using that prop instead of the other prop. Okay, so that's how props get passed from one component to another. Now keep in mind, props always get passed by the parent component. So this gets us to a very important idea in React, which is the way data moves. Okay, there is no way for the child hello to pass data to app. It's only one way. Only one way. App can give things to hello, so you have to kind of imagine these components like a tree. So app's at the top of the tree, and then hello is like the next level down. App can pass information to hello, but hello cannot pass information to app. This is generally where the learning curve really kicks in, and getting used to that. Really, data only flows in one direction, so you have to kind of come up with some interesting patterns in order to like get information in places it normally couldn't go. Okay, so we will play with that. Okay, but that's props. Okay, and you can pass. It's not just strings as props. You could pass anything. So let's add another property. You can add as many props as you want. So we'll say goat equals, and then but if I want to pass something that's like not a string, I have to wrap it in curly brackets, because again, anytime you need to escape normal HTML, you use curly brackets. So in this case, I'm going to send over some JSX. H1 greatest of all time. Okay, and it's in the curly brackets. So now I can go back to my hello.js. Instead of injecting props.bread in there, I will inject props.goat. Greatest of all time. There you go. Okay, so you can pass any data from one component to another. The assumption is that since app is the one who's rendering hello, app can pass data to hello. But hello, since it's rendered by app, cannot pass the data back in the other direction. Okay, so it's always one directional. There are real good performance and functional benefits to this, but it does take some getting used to, because oftentimes you're gonna be like, well, let me send some data back up, but you can't. And this is where you have to do something called lifting state, which is a discussion for another video. The other giant concept when it comes to React is state. Okay, so let me erase hello. We're not going to worry about that now. But this is where it's like the whole updating thing comes along. So I could create variables like this. Like I can create, let's create a counter. Okay, so I'm going to create a variable. Let count equal 1. Okay, so we're going to say, let's make this a fragment. And then h1 we'll put the count. So we'll put that variable here. Now we see 1. Now let me put a button. Okay, so here's a button. I'm going to call it add 1. That's what the button's going to say. Ideally what we want is that we want to add 1 to count every time we click this button. So let's do that. So I'm going to create a function, const add 1 equals, and all this function does is take the count variable and add 1 to it, and then console.log count. So it's changing the variable and then logging it. And now, if you want the button to use the function, we just kind of do it in the old school HTML way. We put it as a property in the button tag. But except it has to be camel case. So you have to do like on click with the uppercase C. And you say on click equals, and then you say it equals the function. So in this case, it equals add 1. Which means anytime I click this button, run this function, add 1. Okay, let me open up my DevTools so we can see the console. Okay, now if I click here, and see, look, it added 1, so it's up to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. But see, the screen doesn't update. Okay, this doesn't update. So the point being is that when your data changes, when normal variables change, React will not update what you see visually. Okay, if you want to update what's being seen visually, you're going to have to use what's called state. Okay, you have to use what's called state. So how do we do that? Remember how I mentioned this React object has a bunch of functions in it that we're going to want to use. One of them is to be able to create a variable that is called state. The big difference is you'll see that when the variable is created via state, that in this case it will actually update. Like the screen will update each time we click. So state will update the screen when it changes, while normal variables won't. Okay, so that's generally always what we mean by something's got to be state, because if you want the screen to update when the data changes, that variable has to be state. So the way you create state is you do this pattern. You say, hey, const, the name of the variable, so count, and then you have to give a name to a function, set count. So this is the name of the variable. This is going to be the name of a function. This function is going to be used to update count. Okay? Why we have to use a function? I'll come back to that. But then you say equals, and then we're going to use this function, react, so the React object, dot use state. That means we're creating a new state variable. And then inside the parentheses, we'll pass in the initial value. So what do we want this count to start at? We'll say 0. Okay, so see now our count is 0. Okay, now still right now, if I just hit this, it's still not going to work. See, I'm going to get this error. Okay, because technically, count is going to be constant. Okay, even if I change this to let, it'll still error. Just give me a different error. Okay, see, it'll still change the variable, but see, the screen's still not updating. Because technically, it's not changing the variable that triggers the update. It's actually the function. The use of set count says, hey, I updated the data. React, go update the screen. So in that case, instead of doing this, just arbitrarily adding 1 to count, I need to use this set count function. And this set count function, I can then say, hey, I want count to equal what count is currently equal plus 1. And that's what the new count will equal. And now let's watch what happens. Okay, so I'm going to refresh the page. And if I click add 1 now, see now it does update. Okay, and you'll notice that this counter is a little bit behind. Okay, because technically the update to the variable is asynchronous. So this console log is going to happen before the update's finishing happening. So moral of the story is don't log the change. You wouldn't want to log the change after the set function. If you want to see the change of the variable, you're better off just logging it here. Console.log count. Now watch what happens. Now it should keep up, because what's happening is that, see, it's logging it right away now, because the minute the component gets rendered to the screen, this whole function's running. So it's running this console.log. And what's really happening under the hood is that every time I change the number, it's actually removing the component and rebuilding it. So it's rerunning this whole function. So this console log is going to happen again every time I click this button, because every time I set state, the component function runs this again, and that's why it gets rebuilt. So I hit 1 and see, like, it's counting. I see it in the log there. Okay. But that's what state does. So imagine when you have like a large array with a bunch of data, and you want to update, and so the data changes. So you want to update the thing, you replace the array with the set function, and that will update the screen. So these are like the basic ideas of React. Okay, originally I wanted to make this video 60 minutes, but this is really the core of React. And at this point, I think it's a good time for you to go and play with just these basic ideas and get used to things like creating a new component, passing that component props, and playing with state. Once you get comfortable with those 3 things, go back to my React playlist, learn some more, but start with that. Like, that's the core. Get comfortable with that first, and then go from there. But that's how React works. Okay, now theoretically, let's say we were done, we were happy with this website, then we could do npm run build, and this command is actually going to go build out our final website. So what that does, it runs a webpack, and then you'll see this build folder gets created, and inside here is actually this is the folder you would deploy. Okay, now if you're using something like Netlify or Render or Vercel, they'll run the build command for you. So you don't have to necessarily run the build command yourself. You would just say, hey, here's my GitHub repo with my code. They'll see that it's React. They'll run the build command and publish. They'll know what to do. But theoretically, otherwise, basically what you would do is you would build the site each time, and then this folder is what you would deploy on your web space in case you're using like static web hosting, like something like a cPanel or something. Okay, but yeah, so that's that's how React works. That's an introduction to React. I have a lot of videos on React, so head over to devnursery.com. You can go check out the React playlist. My name is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.